Hi, this is our third civil rights lecture. So let's get to it. I meant to say I hope you're doing well. Anyway, we're going to be talking about this, the Black Power, mainly Black Power, Black militancy era of the civil era and voices of the civil rights movement. There are two eyes on the prize episodes that give you context for what we're talking about, and you should stop this lecture and watch those episodes. Before getting to Malcolm X, and I'll spend the bulk of my time talking about him, I want to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer because she's a powerful voice within a movement, in the movement, and a different voice. We see her in the Mississippi Is This America um, episode, and in the segments they don't list her name, but she is a voice of the Democratic Freedom Party, and that's toward uh, the end of the episode. But I wanted to feature her because looking at her, we can, as we did with Sojourner Truth, look at her through the lenses of intersectionality and agency. She has sort of the three identities that disprivilege individuals in the United States, and she is black, she's a woman, and she was poor. She's deceased, and she was poor, very poor, in fact, a sharecropper. So she, like Sojourner Truth, for all intents and purposes, had no voice, but she took that voice. She took her own agency, and that took gumption and that took courage because she was beaten. She lost, her daughter died because of the racism, and because there was a backlash against her. She lost her daughter, and she lost her livelihood. But nevertheless, she still was and persisted in being a voice for this movement. She was, one of the women who shaped a movement, but also started to reflect a splinter in the movement. She would skew toward the more civil rights than black power. We see here represented on my left here, SNCC. And that's sort of, if you look at just the optics here, you see black women, sort of traditional looking black women, and then you see probably a handful of years later, you see African American women with a different look. And these are women who were part of the feminist movement. Recall that I said that lots of liberatory movements were going on around the same time as the civil rights movement. And so you had women, or individuals, women here in this case, who were members of multiple movements. And so these women on my right were members of the women's liberation movement. They were also, in addition to being black and female, they were also lesbians as well. So there were convergent and divergent interests there. There was a facet of their identity that I'm sure they didn't see represented in the movement, but also wanted to give voice to the concerns of this movement. If we look at these women, they represent the three phases and facets of the movement. You watched the sit-ins with Diane Nash. Oh, Diane Nash, not just with Diane Nash. Diane led those sit-ins. She was a college student in Tennessee at Fisk University from a relatively privileged background. And on the right here, the left you have Nash. The right you have Kathleen Kathleen Cleaver, and she's the spouse of Eldridge Cleaver, and both of them were leaders of the Black Power, Black Panther movement. I'll show you a clip of that in just a moment. But you can look at just their ethos, their optics, their look is very different. And situated between them is Fannie Lou Hamer, who comes from yet another. She's another voice from another perspective and another background. As I mentioned just a moment ago, was a poor sharecropper who dared to speak. But all of these women were important to the movement, important to the rhetorical acts that were performed, as well as just sort of the empowering words that they uttered. I'm going to show you the Black Power, Black Panther. I guess a facet of their rhetorical acts would be their aesthetics, how they look. So I want us to look at this PBS documentary, or at least a segment from this documentary, that looks at the aesthetics, meaning the look, the clothes, and how those represented or were a part of or reflected their resistance. The resistance, and I should say the militancy of their resistance. Sorry. Am I black enough for you? Am I black enough for you? Am I black enough for you?
This brother here, myself, all of us were born with our hair like this, and we just wear it like this. Reason for it, you might say, is like a new awareness among black people that their own natural appearance, physical appearance, is beautiful. Black people are aware now. They're proud of it. It's pleasing to them. Dig it? Isn't it beautiful? All right. I got to stay black enough for you. I got to stay black enough for you. We're gonna move on up, we ain't never gonna suffer no more. I got to stay black enough for you.
You're talking about people who are teenagers, 17, 18, 19, 20. That's the bulk of the Panthers are teenagers. So the fact that we were so young and the fact that this hadn't happened before, I'm not certain that we recognize how startling it looked to other people.
So you see, at the end, she pretty much says that this was just a startling and a striking look, and that had a rhetorical effect. It identified, it created a kind of a solidarity among people in the movement, and it also, like hip hop, I should say this, like hip hop, it sort of filtered out to the larger African American community, who may not have bought into everything, you know, certainly berets and guns, but still the vibe, the ethos, culturally and aesthetically, there were people who embraced it. Just a little bit more about the rhetoric of Black Panther aesthetics, just in explaining exactly what I mean. Its dress, its ethos, meaning just that whole kind of vibe and posture and carriage. Their hairstyles, remember the natural hairstyles they were talking about, Kathleen Cleaver was talking about, and then also just the accessories, the berets, the jewelry, the Afrocentric garb as well. Moving on from sort of the rhetoric, and that's what I'm going to say about the Black Panthers, is I wanted to look at the rhetoric of their appearance. And we might come back to them in a later assignment. But I will now turn to the rhetoric about Malcolm X, and Malcolm X is discussed in the Time Has Come episode of the Eyes on the Prize. When we think of Malcolm X, I guess I posed the question that I posed to you when we were talking about Rosa Parks. How do you remember them? They're iconic in our collective imaginations, although he's probably remembered very differently than her. I ask you what single word descriptions descriptors, I should say, would you immediately come to mind when you're talking about Malcolm X? And some might be violent or militant, or some of you might know about Black nationalism, strident, I had some students to say hate comes to mind. But Malcolm X was kind of a complex, as many individuals in history are, a complex rhetor. I'm not going to show you this clip, but you will have access to this lecture. But this is, in 1992, Spike Lee made a movie about Malcolm X's militancy. And in this lecture, and then there will be another lecture devoted exclusively to Malcolm X's interviews and a couple of his speeches, or excerpts from his speeches. And to get to them, you just sort of hover over it, and you'll see this bar. You'll see this bar, and you'll see the play triangle, and you'll play either just the audio or the audio visual. So I'm not going to play it, but suffice it to say that Malcolm X, this film elevated the profile of Malcolm X long after he died in the 1990s. I'm going to just talk a little bit about his personal background. I'm going to talk about his rhetoric, and then what he means to us today. This is just a timeline. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and he was disenchanted with school and the racism in school. He went to live with a sister in Baltimore, I believe, somewhere in the Northeast, and fell into petty thievery, was sent to prison, and then there he sort of was converted to become to the Nation of Islam, or Muslim. It's a sect. It's not really Orthodox Islam, but I think they may be more orthodox today. But he was converted. He became very zealous when he was released from prison. He rose to the ranks of the Nation of Islam. He became one of their most powerful and most prominent ministers and spokesperson. And because of it, of his rhetoric and his rhetorical prowess, he attracted a lot of attention. The leaders didn't like it. He broke with the Nation of Islam and then was assassinated in 1965. I wanted to point something out that he actually shares in common with Frederick Douglass, and that is the belief in the power of knowledge and literacy, especially. We talked about Douglass and how when he learned to read, how that opened up just a whole new world, whole new vistas in his world, and it made him more intent on being free. I think he mentions that he'd rather die than be a slave, and the sort of the catalyst for that was his literacy. And freedom does in fact begin with your thinking and your mind, and when your mind is stimulated and when it's opened up, and if you're invited or promoted or compelled to think on your own, it can lead you to different places. And which is why oppressors, one of the things that autocrats and oppressors want to do is they have to control the information that you get and how you interpret that information, lest that information be really very empowering. So just this slide reminds us about Frederick Douglass and what they share in common. Malcolm X, while in prison, he learned to read, of course, when he was in grade school, but he became a voracious reader in prison. And he didn't just read, religious literature, but he read philosophy. He studied philosophy and math and history especially. And it had the same effect on him that just being able to read had on Frederick Douglass. So literacy was really, when we think about an accounting for a rhetor, his perspective and the trajectory of his life, for these two individuals, it was literacy was extremely important. When we're talking about Malcolm X's rhetorical activities, or who he was as a rhetor, he was interesting. All of these descriptors, or all of these adjectives, all of these character traits are accurate where he is concerned. He was intelligent, he was passionate, but he was also very civil. He could be genteel, he was respectful, he was chivalrous, and part of that was the Nation of Islam. They were very ascetic in their manner, ascetic, conservative, very disciplined in their manner and in their dress, but he was also very strident. He was resentful. His rhetoric had an urgency and an impatience to it, and prone to sort of invective and ridicule and name calling. He liked to engage. He liked to engage the media, and they liked him too because he was a character. The foundations and the themes in Malcolm X's rhetoric, of course, in the early days, he promoted the Nation of Islam and talked about the honorable, emphasis on honorable, Elijah Muhammad, who was the leader of that sect. He inverted the racial hierarchy by positing whites as devils, whites as evils, and importantly, they were in his mind, they were essentially evil, which means, we talked about in class how African Americans, when were seen in society as being essentially inferior, right? Which means that this is not, when you're essentially something, it means you were made that way by nature, and so you can't change. And that's the way Malcolm X talked about whites. He derided a weak black middle class and leaders like Martin Luther King. He called them Uncle Toms. He just said they were weak and they were leading people astray, leading lambs to the slaughter, especially with that. His nonviolent philosophies. People were attacking them, and the philosophy said you did not attack back, and Malcolm thought that was just crazy. He believed in education and also enlightenment, black nationalism. He was a black separatist, which meant that he wanted blacks to form a nation within a nation and with a solid economic structure and solid institutions. He was also Pan-Africanist meaning that he connected the struggle, the black struggle in the United States with African struggle in Africa. So it wasn't, he didn't speak in terms of civil rights, but he spoke more in terms of human rights. And so his goal was to raise black people's awareness about their consciousness of their situation in the United States. He wanted to raise their awareness about, and also to empower them to be on their own and to be separate. He wanted the race to progress, but he thought that the program for black progress was black nationalism and to separate from whites. And then he recruited from the Nation of Islam. He recruited for the Nation of Islam when he was a member, but then when he separated, he had his own organization, the OAAU. His audiences were certainly the Nation of Islam, and he was their spokesperson. He was their motivator, and he, just confirmed and validated the rightness of their cause and of their philosophy. Urban did a lot of street speaking to urban blacks, so he was based out of New York and Harlem. And he sort of traveled through that northeast corridor and spoke to urban blacks. So they were targets that King's message didn't necessarily resonate with them. Just the hyper nonviolence did not necessarily it wasn't as attractive as it was to the blacks and to blacks in these cities, and because they weren't Christian necessarily, and certainly not in the same way that Southern blacks were. So King didn't hold as big of an appeal as maybe Malcolm X did. Black press liked him for the most part. I mean, if you listen to him, and he was kind of a darling in quotes of the black and white press. If you, the blacks had black press had a grudging admiration for him because some of his critiques of racism in America was spot on. Whites, they liked to, he was controversial, and so they wanted controversial for their pages because controversy sold papers, and so he was kind of a media darling. When we think about the style and substance of his rhetoric, there's a dual rhetorical style. There is the Oxford debater. He didn't go to Oxford, but he studied quite a lot, and he was a sharp debater. And as a matter of fact, I have a separate lecture or a separate set of slides with his with some of his interviews and debates on them. And then he was also sort of a street speaker. He was a campaigner. He was, he knew how to hype a crowd up. He knew how to ridicule his opponent and belittle them and get the crowd laughing at, his opponent. This is it's another one of those slides, a slide with an embedded video in the, notice I've hovered, and you see this at the bottom, and it's just a documentary, a 1959 documentary, and that's kind of when the world mainstream press discovered Malcolm X, and CBS made a documentary about him, and this is just an excerpt from that. I won't play that for you, but you may play it at your leisure. Malcolm became more and more popular. There was a fissure, a break. There was sort of conflict between him and the Nation of Islam. He broke with them. He embraced more mainstream Orthodox Islam. He went to Mecca. He traveled to Mecca. I think, as a matter of fact, he was poisoned while he was there, but he survived and came home and started an organization on his, apart from the Nation of Islam. He had a problem, though, because he had ridiculed other African American leaders, activist groups, and so they didn't necessarily want to work with him. So all of this vitriolic rhetoric that he had spewed about them. Now he kind of needed them. He needed to form kind of a partnership with them, and they were not eager to embrace him. So he was struggling before he died. Malcolm in the media, as I said, he was a media darling. This will be a video that talks a little bit about him and the press and how the press, liked him, and he embraced them, and he knew how to use the press. He knew how to use the press just because, the political economy of the media was, we need to sell whatever. We need to sell, we need advertisers if we're on television. We need advertisers and subscribers for papers. And so we need interesting stories, and he made for an interesting story. He used provocative language, and he, as I said, he criticized, harshly criticized before it was cool, his opponents. And he embodied sort of infamy and power, and he was, had some notoriety. But on the one hand, he was an honorable, most people say he was honorable in his own way, his rhetoric notwithstanding. In 1965, he went to Selma. You saw Selma, Bloody Sunday, the riots, and how the police were viciously attacking Dr. King and the protesters, and his wife was there, and Malcolm actually came, broken from the Nation of Islam. He actually came, and there is a quote. Here's a quote of a statement that he purportedly made to Coretta King, and I think she confirmed this, that he wanted Dr. King to know that he didn't come to make his job difficult. He said strategically he came to make it easier, just because if whites saw the contrast, if the white power structure saw the contrast between him and King, they would prefer King. And so maybe it would drive them to the negotiating table. So he wasn't hateful. He just knew how to work a crowd. Let's see. The appropriation and the legacy of Malcolm X. Well, he's still very an iconic image, just like Rosa Parks, though in a different way. But not with Rosa Parks. You don't see, hats with their name on it, or T-shirts with their name on it, or or snippets of what she said or what she did, posted and worn, as just kind of this cultural garb. But of course, with Malcolm, you do, and Malcolm has a place in the cultural imagination, especially among African Americans, as sort of the embodiment of militancy and of resistance against, the system, a white system. And so he holds an appeal for certain voices in the African American community. Some fully embrace, and some there's a grudging respect for him and the way that he stood up, and he's still remembered, and of course his name and symbols appear on clothing and the like. This is just and I won't play this, but you can again hover and you can play it. And this was a rap video for Sister Souljah. She was a rap artist in the early 90s, and this is a take on the documentary that introduced Malcolm in 1959 that I mentioned earlier, The Hate That Hate Produced, and it's just an indictment against racism. And there again, it's sort of Malcolm, or the spirit of Malcolm, or channeling Malcolm in some way through this song. Spectre of Malcolm, as I look at this, I say that's the specter of Malcolm, and you see all these people protesting, but it could be the specter of Martin Luther King as well, both of them. The idea of resistance, the performance, engaging resistance, physical resistance, and rhetorical acts. With Trayvon Martin, you see kind of, I guess, the rhetoric of kind of aesthetics here. Both of these I've introduced to you in the last two lectures, because beyond just the speeches, there were other things that were going on that were used to assert a message, to resist, or to assert a resistance message. And you can see here the wearing of t-shirts, you can see the kneeling, you can see the imagery here that reflects, you know, the sort of the I can't breathe, the injustice, and then of course Trayvon Martin and this image of the hoodie and what it came to, the hoodie and Trayvon Martin came to symbolize to a generation. The legacy of Malcolm X in public discourse, it's interesting. We have public discourse, and not just black public discourse in general skews more toward Malcolm than Martin, right? You've got, you know, everyone's trying to critique and manipulate the media, just like Malcolm. Uncivilized discourse, just like Malcolm, where you name call, where you don't invite anybody to engage with you. As a matter of fact, you invite people to go the opposite because you ridicule them, because you criticize them, and because you call them names. He was the embodiment of a group of people who were enraged by racism, right? And so he's became their representative, and we have several politicians across the sort of socio-political landscape who do represent that. Politicians and even media folks who represent anger and who are always angry. The promotion of black entrepreneurship, that's Malcolm X. He and the Nation of Islam believed in, you know, having a strong, solid economic base, a base that didn't need any government handouts, and so he was very much against that. And then also the critique of racial bias and racism in society that we see, calling it out. Martin Luther King did that, but Malcolm did it as well and had his own way of doing it. This is just a paper idea. This probably could have gone elsewhere, but remember the kinetic rhetorical act of Bree Newsom. Well, you don't remember Bree Newsom, but remember kinetic rhetoric, right? Rhetoric of the body, or rhetoric with the body. And this is Bree Newsom became a hero to, I guess, men and women, blacks and whites, when she climbed the pole of climbed a flagpole on the grounds of the South Carolina State House, I believe, and removed the Confederate flag. She was ultimately arrested for it, but once she did that, there were lots of cartoons created about her. And you see a few of them here. I just think they would be interesting to analyze for a paper. So anyway, this is just Bree Newsom and some pictures of her, and that's her being taken away and arrested. And I guess kinetic rhetoric, militancy, using the body to resist, the optics of that harken back to the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and also Malcolm X, when you actually move and act against injustice, or and she perceived the flag as injustice and something that was an affront to citizens and needed to go. Okay, so that is the end of the slideshow. I'm going to create another another mini lecture about the journal exercise, and that is it. So I guess I will see you next time.